The night they walked away did not arrive with thunder, with shattered glass, or with some dramatic final sentence that would have at least given your pain a clean place to land. It came the way life-changing moments often do in America, wrapped in something painfully ordinary. A phone screen lighting up in a dim room. A message that was too short for the weight it carried. A silence after it that felt louder than any argument ever could. You kept reading the same words again and again, not because they were hard to understand, but because they were too easy to understand. That was the cruelty of it. There was no mystery in what they were saying, no room to pretend, no hidden softness tucked between the lines. Just a quiet ending placed in your hands like a cold object you never asked to hold. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. A porch light flickered across the street. Somebody's dog barked twice and then stopped. Tires hissed over wet pavement somewhere beyond the apartment complex. A television glowed blue behind a window in the building across from yours. The world had not cracked open to match what was happening inside you. No sign appeared in the sky. No angel interrupted the moment. No voice from heaven reached down and explained why someone you prayed over, cried over, showed up for, and believed in had suddenly become another door closing in your face. The room just stayed still, and you sat there with that strange feeling people rarely talk about, the feeling of being emotionally hit so hard that your body goes quiet before your heart even catches up. At first, you did what almost everyone does when abandonment shows up, wearing the face of somebody they trusted. You blamed yourself, not all at once, but in pieces. Maybe you were too much. Maybe you loved too deeply. Maybe you asked for too much honesty, too much consistency, too much presence. Maybe your need to feel safe had become too heavy for them. Maybe your faith made them uncomfortable. Maybe your standards had started sounding like pressure. Maybe you should have been easier, softer, quieter, less intense, less observant, less aware. That is what pain does when it enters a person who already carries old wounds. It does not just break your heart in the present. It drags every earlier disappointment out of hiding and lines them up like witnesses against you. So you sat on the edge of your bed with your phone still in your hand and let the thoughts come like dark birds. You remembered all the little signs you had excused, the delayed replies, the strange distance, the way their warmth had become selective, the way your spirit had started feeling tired after conversations that used to feel like home. You remembered the times you sensed something had shifted and talked yourself out of trusting it, because trusting it would have forced you to face what you were not ready to lose. And now, here it was anyway. Loss. Not the kind dressed up as noble sacrifice. Not the kind that makes a person look brave and poetic. Just the raw kind. The kind that sits in your chest and asks what was real then. You wanted a reason big enough to justify the ache. You wanted a final conversation that would somehow make the ending feel holy instead of humiliating. You wanted them to explain themselves in a way that protected your dignity. But the truth was already beginning to move beneath the pain, even if you could not name it yet. This was not just an exit. It was an exposure. Something had been wrong longer than you wanted to admit. Something had been draining you while you were still calling it love. Something had been dimming your peace while you kept praying for it to survive. But in that first hour, you could not see any of that clearly. All you could see was absence. All you could feel was the sting of being left with your memories, your questions, and the terrible temptation to rewrite yourself in order to make their leaving make sense. The next morning, life had the nerve to continue. Your alarm still went off, emails still waited, Coffee still needed to be made. Traffic still gathered at red lights. People still posted cheerful things online as if the world were not full of private funerals no one else could see. You moved through the day with that fragile, floating feeling that comes after emotional shocks, smiling when required, answering when needed, functioning just enough to avoid being noticed too closely. But inside, something had already cracked open. Not just grief, recognition. Somewhere underneath the ache was a whisper you were not yet ready to hear. A whisper that would one day save you. Not everyone who leaves you is rejecting you. Some people are being removed because they cannot go where God is taking you. But you did not believe that yet. Not that day. That day still belonged to confusion. That day still belonged to the version of you who thought every ending meant you had failed to be enough. You drove home in silence after work past a church sign that read, "God is still writing your story," and almost laughed at how cruel hope can sound when your chest is still bleeding. At a stoplight, you looked at your own reflection in the windshield and barely recognized the weariness in your eyes. You had been carrying more than the relationship itself. You had been carrying its instability, its mixed signals, its unspoken tension, its emotional weight, the exhausting job of holding together what the other person had already started dropping. Maybe that was why the loss hurt so badly. You were not only grieving them, you were grieving how much of yourself had been spent trying to keep something alive that was already quietly dying. That night, you did not pray eloquently. You did not quote scripture with strength and fire. You just sat in the dark of your living room, the lamp off the glow from the kitchen clock, the only light in the apartment, and whispered, "God, why did you let them go?" It was not a polished prayer. It was not faith-filled and victorious. It was tired, honest, bare. And maybe that was the first sacred thing about this ending. For the first time in a long time, you were not performing strength. You were bringing God the truth before you had a lesson to attach to it. No answer came right away, just silence. Deep, still unmoving silence. But this silence was different from the silence they left behind. Their silence felt like withdrawal, avoidance, distance. This silence felt watchful. It felt like heaven standing in the room, not yet explaining, but not abandoning either. And although you could not know it then, the story had already changed. What felt like the beginning of your breaking was actually the beginning of your separation. The hand of God was already moving behind the pain, already clearing what your heart would have kept holding, already protecting an elevation you had not yet stepped into. The person you were crying over had walked out, yes, but something greater had stepped in. And before this story was over, you were going to understand that the exit you did not understand was never the end of your story. It was the first sign that heaven had decided your next season could no longer stay crowded. There was a time when being around them felt like exhaling. That was what made the change so hard to name at first. Nothing poisonous ever introduces itself as poison. It arrives disguised as comfort, wrapped in familiarity, carrying memories that make your guard feel unnecessary. In the beginning, their presence had felt like relief from the noise of the world. Their voice softened rooms inside you that had been loud for years. Their attention felt warm. Their laughter made hard days easier to carry. Even the smallest things began to take on meaning. A text at the right moment, a long conversation after midnight, the simple fact of feeling seen in a world where so many people only glanced. You did not fall because you were foolish. You fell because something about it felt safe enough to rest in, and for a while, maybe it really was. That is what makes later heartbreak so disorienting. You are not just grieving what it became. You are grieving that it was not always a lie. Some part of it felt real, and that reality kept you staying longer than peace would have advised. But love does not always collapse with a loud crash. Sometimes it changes weight so slowly you do not realize you have been carrying it differently until your soul starts limping. Looking back, you could see how the shift began in small ways. The conversations that once left you calm began leaving you restless. The connection that once felt mutual began feeling like maintenance. You started noticing that after spending time with them, you did not feel nourished. You felt drained. There was this subtle pressure you could never quite explain. Pressure to say the right thing. Pressure not to ask too much. Pressure to ignore what your spirit was picking up. Pressure to keep things smooth. Keep things hopeful. Keep things from tipping into honesty. What had once felt like peace had started asking you to work too hard just to keep it from disappearing. That is one of the saddest truths a heart can face when love stops being a place where you can rest and becomes a place where you must manage. And you did manage. You managed your tone. You managed your disappointment. You managed your questions so they would not sound like accusations. You managed your hurt so it would not scare them away. You managed your expectations because every time you held them naturally, something in the relationship grew tense. You became careful in ways that did not feel like wisdom. They felt like fear dressed up as maturity. You told yourself you were being patient, understanding, gracious. But underneath all that grace was a quiet exhaustion you had no language for yet. Real love can require effort, yes, but it should not require the constant editing of your own spirit. The heaviness did not just live in your emotions, it began to spill into your inner life with God. That part unsettled you most because it was harder to blame on personality differences or simple miscommunication. You started noticing that the closer you got to this person emotionally, the noisier your spirit became. Prayer felt crowded. Discernment felt blurred. You would leave conversations with them and struggle to hear clearly afterward. Your peace did not vanish in one dramatic moment. It got diluted. That was the danger. If something attacks you openly, you resist it. But if it slowly clouds your spiritual atmosphere while still calling itself love, you keep trying to save it because you do not want to seem cynical or cold. So you kept showing up to God with a heart full of static, asking Him to bless something that kept leaving you more confused than clear. Even your body had been trying to tell you before your mind was ready. You could see that now. There were nights you could not settle after talking to them, not because of a fight, but because of the strange emotional residue left behind. There were mornings you woke up already heavy, your chest tight with the effort of carrying what had never been said out loud. There were moments when your phone lit up with their name, and instead of joy, you felt a flicker of tension first. Not always, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to reveal that what once felt like comfort had started becoming pressure before you were willing to admit it. Your nervous system knew the truth before your loyalty did. That happens more often than people realize. The body starts bracing while the heart is still making excuses. And you were so good at making excuses. You made them because you cared, because you understood brokenness, because you knew life was hard and people were complicated and not everyone knew how to love cleanly. You gave meaning to every inconsistency. They were tired, they were stressed, they had old wounds, they were afraid of vulnerability, they were under pressure. They did not mean it that way. They had a lot going on. Maybe all of that was true. But truth can explain behavior without excusing its effect. A person can be hurting and still become heavy in your life. A person can mean well and still drain your peace. A person can love you in the only way they know how and still not be safe to walk closely with. Maturity is not just learning to understand other people. It is learning to stop sacrificing your own clarity in the name of understanding them. What made it worse was that you kept comparing the present version of the relationship to the memory of what it had been. That is how many people stay too long. They keep loving the beginning while surviving the middle. They keep reaching for the first warmth even after the atmosphere has changed. You kept remembering the ease, the tenderness, the moments that felt genuine, the signs that made you believe this was different. And because those memories were real, you kept giving the current heaviness more time than it deserved. You were not clinging to fantasy, you were clinging to emotional history. But history can become a trap when it keeps you loyal to something that no longer carries the same spirit. And still, even in the middle of all that confusion, there were moments when heaven tried to interrupt you with truth. Small moments, quiet ones, the kind you can ignore if you are not ready. A sudden unease after a conversation that seemed fine on the surface. A scripture about peace that hit you harder than usual. A deep breath you did not realize you were holding until they had gone silent for a day or two. A strange lightness when you imagined letting go, followed immediately by guilt for even thinking that way. Those moments mattered because they were showing you something your emotions kept resisting. Love had started feeling heavy because you were no longer meant to carry it in that form. And maybe that was the deeper heartbreak. Not just that the relationship had changed, but that you had changed too. God was awakening things in you that could no longer live comfortably inside confusion. Your spirit was becoming more sensitive to what your old self might have tolerated. Your heart was starting to outgrow survival patterns you once called loyalty. The pressure was increasing not only because the relationship was becoming draining, but because the version of you God was raising up could no longer breathe in something that required so much self-betrayal to maintain. So when you look back now, you do not just remember being left. You remember the weight that came before the leaving. You remember how hard you worked to keep calling it piece after piece had already begun slipping out the back door. You remember how often you prayed for clarity while secretly hoping clarity would not cost you the connection. You remember the exhaustion, the confusion, the heaviness, the way love slowly stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like something you had to hold up with trembling hands. And that is when the truth begins to settle in painful but clean. They did not just leave a peaceful relationship behind. The relationship had already stopped being peaceful long before the exit. Their leaving only exposed what your spirit had been carrying in silence for far too long. The hardest truth was not that they left. The hardest truth was realizing they had been slowly resisting the version of you that was beginning to rise long before they ever walked away. At first, you did not want to believe that. It felt too sharp, too cold, too unfair. You wanted to think the relationship simply failed under pressure. That timing was wrong. That life got complicated. That feelings changed. That maybe nobody was really at fault. Those explanations were easier to hold because they protected your image of them and spared you from facing a more painful possibility. But healing has a way of pulling softer lies out by the root. And the longer you sat with the truth, the more clearly you could see it. They were comfortable with the version of you that bent. The version that explained too much, gave too much, waited too long, forgave too quickly, and stayed emotionally available even when your own soul was running on fumes. But the moment you began becoming clearer, steadier, more discerning, something in them changed. It was subtle at first. They did not stand in front of you and announce that your healing made them uncomfortable. People rarely say the truest thing out loud when that truth makes them look small. Instead, it showed up in reactions, in tone, in distance, in the invisible friction that entered the room when you stopped responding the same way. When you started pausing before answering instead of instantly reassuring them. When you stopped spilling every thought just to prove you had nothing to hide. When you no longer apologized for needing consistency, honesty, or peace. When your energy shifted from chasing to observing, from over-functioning to listening, from emotional labor to emotional honesty. You were not becoming cruel. You were becoming whole. But wholeness feels like rejection to people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. They liked you most when you were carrying the relationship with both hands and still thanking them for letting you. They liked the version of you that translated confusion into patience, mixed signals into hope, silence into understanding. That version of you was easy to keep close because that version did not make many demands on reality. That version worked hard to see the best in people even when the evidence was wearing thin. That version could be counted on to reopen the conversation, repair the tension, smooth over the awkwardness, and preserve the connection at almost any personal cost. You called it loyalty at the time. You called it love. But now, you could see that some of what you called love was really fear. Fear of being left. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear that if you stopped over-giving, the whole thing would collapse and you would have to face how uneven it had always been. And maybe somewhere in them, consciously or not, they knew it too. They knew you were the one holding more weight. They knew you were the one turning scraps into meals, silence into stories, inconsistency into chances. They knew you made the connection easier to keep than it should have been. Not because you were weak, but because you were willing. Because your heart had been trained to work hard for what should have been mutual. Because some part of you still believed that if you loved well enough, someone would eventually meet you with the same depth. But relationships built on one person constantly stretching to preserve them begin to panic when that person starts standing upright. That was the shift they could not fully tolerate. You began standing upright. You began healing in ways that made you less available for emotional chaos. You began noticing patterns instead of merely reacting to moments. You began hearing your own spirit again. And once a person can hear themselves clearly, they become much harder to manipulate, much harder to confuse, much harder to keep in a fog. That did not mean you became suspicious of everyone. It meant you stopped betraying your own discernment just to keep somebody comfortable. You stopped treating your instincts like enemies. You stopped assuming every uneasy feeling was insecurity. He had seen the exhaustion you carried from constantly interpreting, managing, softening, and sustaining dynamics that required you to ignore your own inner truth. He had seen how often you came into prayer confused, not because he was unclear, but because too many other voices had been given authority inside your emotional world. And because he loved you more than your comfort, he began pulling you out of every atmosphere where your smallness was being mistaken for goodness. This is why their leaving hurt so much. Not just because you loved them, but because some part of you had tied love itself to being manageable, to being soft enough not to threaten anyone, to being generous enough to never require balance, to being understanding enough to never fully name harm. Their leaving touched that old lie and tried to activate it one last time. See it whispered. The moment you stopped being endlessly available, they drifted. The moment you became stronger, they got colder. The moment you started healing, the connection weakened. Maybe the lesson is that love only stays when you stay small. But that was never the lesson. That was the trap. The real lesson was holier and far more liberating. Anyone who can only stay close to you while you are diminished is not in alignment with who God is calling you to become. Anyone who is soothed by your confusion but threatened by your clarity was never loving you in the full light of truth. Anyone who calls your healing a problem is revealing their relationship with your pain. And once you truly see it, your grief changes shape. It is still grief, but it becomes cleaner. It is no longer just the pain of being left. It becomes the pain of recognizing how long you were trying to be loved in a form that cost you too much of yourself. So now, when you look back, you do not only see what they did, you see what they preferred. They preferred the version of you who overgave and called it devotion, the version who over-explained and called it communication, the version who stayed available at all costs and called it faithfulness. But God was not preserving that version of you. He was delivering you from her. And that is why the separation had to come. Because the next season of your life could not be built on the personality they found easiest to handle. It had to be built on the stronger, clearer, more anchored self that heaven had been forming in secret all along. After they left, silence moved into your life like a new tenant that had not asked permission. It sat in the empty places where conversation used to be. It followed you into the kitchen when you made coffee for one. It rode with you through traffic when the radio could not quite fill the space. It waited in your apartment at night in the quiet buzz of the refrigerator, in the soft hum of the ceiling fan, in the glow of your phone, when no message came from the name your heart still checked for out of habit. There is a particular loneliness that comes after emotional separation, and it is not just the absence of a person. It is the collapse of a rhythm, the end of an expectation, the sudden stillness where your mind had once been occupied with managing, anticipating, hoping, bracing. When that stops, even pain can feel like company. And in those first weeks, you almost preferred the old confusion to the new emptiness, because at least confusion had movement in it. The season that followed was not cinematic. It did not look like spiritual victory. It looked like ordinary life, stripped of distractions. It looked like waking up and checking your phone less out of hope and more out of reflex. It looked like going to work and answering people politely while carrying an ache that had no visible bruise. It looked like sitting in church while worship songs touched places in you that were still too raw to name. It looked like grocery store aisles, laundry baskets, traffic lights, bills on the counter, takeout containers in the trash, and long evenings that seemed to stretch wider now that the emotional noise was gone. You had wanted God to explain the separation quickly, maybe even reward your obedience immediately with some clear new blessing, some obvious next door, some dazzling reassurance that this loss was leading somewhere meaningful. Instead, He gave you space. And space can feel cruel before it starts feeling holy. At first, you interpreted that emptiness the way wounded people often do. You thought maybe God was taking things from you because you had failed some invisible test. Maybe this was punishment. Maybe you had held too tightly, loved too much, expected too much, needed too much. Maybe heaven was not protecting you at all. Maybe it was reducing you, cutting you down, leaving you alone with yourself because there was something in you that still needed to be broken. It is amazing how quickly pain can make a person assume the worst about God's intentions. Not because you do not believe He is good, but because unhealed grief has a way of translating silence into rejection. And when your life starts feeling empty, your flesh will often call it abandonment before your spirit has enough strength to call it pruning. But slowly, almost too slowly for your impatient heart, another truth began to rise. The emptiness was not random. It had shape. It had purpose. You began noticing that what had been removed from your life was not only a person. It was an atmosphere, a strain, a chronic emotional overcrowding that had been filling your days with tension, second-guessing, overthinking, and low-level spiritual fatigue. You had been living in a crowded inner world for so long that when God finally started clearing it out, the quiet felt unnatural. But unnatural is not the same as wrong. Sometimes peace feels unfamiliar simply because chaos stayed too long. That is when the deeper realization began to form. God was not emptying your life to punish you. He was creating room. Room for clarity, room for healing, room for new patterns that would not have survived inside the clutter of the old ones. Room for your spirit to breathe without constantly compensating for someone else's inconsistency. Room for your mind to stop spinning around relational confusion and start listening again. Room for your future to enter without having to squeeze past people, habits, and attachments that no longer belonged. The loneliness was real, yes, but it was not meaningless. It was transitional space. And transitional space rarely feels beautiful when you are standing inside it. It feels exposed, bare, echoing. Yet many of the holiest things God does begin in rooms that feel too empty at first. You saw it in small ways before you could articulate it fully. You noticed that your mornings felt less emotionally hijacked. You noticed that after the first wave of grief passed each day, there was less tension in your chest. You noticed how much energy had once gone into decoding things that should have been simple. You noticed that your prayer life, though still tender, was becoming cleaner. There was less static in it, less desperation, less bargaining, less trying to force God to keep alive what your spirit had already been dying under. The absence still hurt, but underneath the hurt, something was beginning to settle. Not joy yet, not even relief all the time, but a steadier ground. A sense that maybe, just maybe, what felt like loss was also the first real chance your soul had gotten to stop living crowded. And your destiny had been crowded. Not just by them, but by everything their presence activated in you. The old fear of being left, the old habit of over-explaining, the old reflex to earn closeness through emotional labor, the old temptation to call your own discernment harsh just because it threatened a connection you were afraid to lose. Their presence had not simply occupied a place in your heart. It had recruited old wounds to help keep that place defended. That is why the separation felt like more than a breakup, more than a drift, more than a closed door. It felt like a rearrangement of your inner house. Furniture had been pulled out of rooms you were used to navigating in the dark. And now that the rooms were emptier, you could finally see how much space had been taken up by what was never meant to stay. There were still nights when the loneliness rose like a tide. Nights when you missed not just them, but the idea of being chosen by someone, of being reached for, of being seen. Nights when you wanted comfort so badly that you almost romanticized what had drained you. That is the danger of lonely seasons. They do not just make you miss people, they make you vulnerable to remembering selectively. But every time you drifted too far into nostalgia, reality would return quietly and firmly. Peace had been leaving long before they did. You had been carrying this relationship like a load, not resting in it like a refuge. And God, in His mercy, was not going to let your future remain stuffed with things that required your spirit to stay bent. One Sunday, as you sat through service, half listening and half praying, the pastor said a line that seemed to pass through everyone else and land directly in your chest. He said, "When God starts preparing you for what is next, one of the first things He often does is remove what cannot honor where you are going. It was a simple sentence, nothing flashy, but it opened something, because suddenly the season made more sense. The removals were not proof that your life was getting smaller. They were proof that God refused to let your calling be buried under things that were familiar but unfit. He was not crowding your future with who had access to your past. He was clearing it. That thought changed the way you carried the loneliness. You still felt it, but you stopped letting it define the meaning of the season. Loneliness was no longer evidence that you had been forgotten. It was often evidence that the old room had been emptied before the new thing arrived. And that is how God works more often than people want to admit. He rarely decorates bondage. He clears it. He rarely adds fresh purpose on top of unresolved entanglement. He separates first. He creates holy space before he fills it. Because what belongs to your next season should not have to compete with what heaven has already marked for removal. So you kept walking through the disorienting middle. You kept making dinner in the quiet, kept driving home through dusk-colored streets, kept reading scripture when it felt alive and when it felt dry, kept learning how to sit in a life that was no longer crowded by constant emotional maintenance. And slowly, with the kind of patience only God can sustain, your heart began to understand what your pain had fought so hard to resist. This was not emptiness as punishment. This was emptiness as preparation. God was not taking from you because he wanted you diminished. He was making room because your destiny could no longer stay crowded with what had no business crossing into your future. The silence did not give you what you wanted. It gave you what you needed, which at first felt like an insult. You wanted closure. You wanted some final conversation that would line up the facts, explain the motives, honor the history, and leave your dignity standing upright in the wreckage. You wanted answers with enough emotional intelligence to make the ending feel meaningful instead of abrupt. You wanted to know when things changed, why they changed, whether any of it was real, whether they ever understood what they were doing to you, whether they missed you too, whether their distance was confusion or intention, whether the whole thing could have been saved if one sentence had been said sooner, more gently, more honestly. Your mind circled those questions like a moth around a porch light, exhausted but unable to stop. But silence kept refusing to feed that hunger. No explanation came. No real apology. No grand reveal. Just the stubborn ache of unanswered things and the slow, uncomfortable truth that your healing was not going to be built on their clarity. That is when silence became a teacher, not a soft teacher, not the kind who pats your shoulder and tells you everything will make sense by morning. Silence teaches the way winter teaches, by stripping, by taking away distractions, by forcing you to sit with what remains when no one is messaging, no one is clarifying, no one is reaching back, and no one is helping you keep the emotional story alive. Without their voice filling the room, your own inner world became impossible to avoid. The questions you had asked about them began turning into questions about yourself. Why had you stayed so long in something that kept making your spirit tired? Why had uncertainty felt so familiar that you called it love? Why had you worked so hard to preserve a connection that demanded so much shrinking from you? Why did their silence feel like a verdict on your worth instead of a revelation of their capacity? Those questions hurt because they touched older places. The relationship itself had not created all your pain. It had activated what was already there. The fear of being too much, the ache of being left, the reflex to work harder when love felt unstable. The old belief that if you could just explain yourself clearly enough, love would become safe. Silence exposed those patterns because it left you alone with them. And for a while that felt unbearable. There were evenings when you sat on the couch with the television on, but did not really watch it because your mind was too busy replaying old conversations and trying to rescue yourself from the past. There were mornings when you woke up already tired, not from sleep loss, but from carrying invisible emotional archaeology all night long. You were digging through yourself, and some of what you found was not flattering. Some of it was grief. Some of it was fear. Some of it was dependency wearing the clothes of devotion. That was one of the hardest truths the silence taught you. Not everything you called love was actually love. Some of it was emotional dependency. Some of it was the deep, panicked attachment that forms when another person starts to feel like the answer to wounds only God can truly reach. You did care for them. That part was real. Your affection was real. Your tenderness was real. Your intentions were real. But woven into that love was something heavier, something more desperate. You needed the connection to stay alive, not just because you valued them, but because losing it touched parts of you that did not yet know how to stand alone without feeling abandoned. You were not only loving them, you were leaning on what they represented. Validation, safety, hope, chosenness, relief from loneliness. Proof that your heart was not too deep, too much, too inconvenient to hold. And that is why the separation shook you so hard. It was not just heartbreak, it was withdrawal. Not from love alone, but from emotional dependence. Your soul had gotten used to orienting around their presence, their response, their warmth, their inconsistency, their possibility. When that vanished, your inner world panicked because the structure it had been leaning on was gone. Silence revealed that panic with brutal honesty. It showed you how often your peace had been tied to their behavior. How much of your emotional weather had depended on whether they were near attentive, warm, or distant. Real love does not erase your center. Real love may move you deeply, but it does not become the axis your whole sense of self spins around. Dependency does that. Dependency makes another person feel like oxygen, then calls the panic of losing them romance. That realization did not make you ashamed, at least not forever. At first it stung, because nobody wants to discover that some of their deepest feelings were mixed with hunger. But as the silence continued, its work shame slowly gave way to compassion. Of course you had leaned too hard in places. Of course you had confused attention with safety sometimes. Of course you had tried to turn human closeness into a shelter strong enough to hold what only divine love can truly steady. You were human. You were wounded in places you had not fully faced. And wounded people do not always choose what is healthiest. Sometimes they choose what feels familiar. Sometimes they choose the emotional pattern that resembles old pain, because familiarity can masquerade as destiny when the soul is still trying to heal. And that brought you to the second great lesson. Silence taught you the difference between divine peace and familiar chaos. For so long, you had mistaken intensity for depth. You had mistaken uncertainty for mystery. You had mistaken emotional highs and lows for significance. If something stirred you deeply, challenged you, kept you thinking, made you long ache, hope, and wait, part of you assumed it must mean something extraordinary. But silence began clearing that fog. It showed you that familiar chaos can feel powerful simply because it activates all your deepest wiring. It pulls you in. It keeps you alert. It convinces you that because you feel so much, the connection must be profound. But divine peace feels different. divine peace does not perform. It does not keep you guessing to stay alive. It does not require confusion to feel deep. It is clean. It steadies instead of destabilizes. It leaves room for breath room, for truth room, for your spirit to stay intact. At first, peace felt boring compared to the emotional storm you had been used to. That was humbling to admit. Chaos had trained your nervous system to associate tension with importance. So when silence stripped the drama away, part of you felt understimulated, restless, almost tempted to reopen doors just to feel something familiar again. But the longer you stayed still, the more your spirit adjusted. You began to notice how exhausting familiar chaos had been, how much energy it took to live in constant interpretation, how much of your prayer life had been spent not on purpose growth or worship, but on relationship triage. Peace was not boring. It was just new to the parts of you that had grown used to surviving. And in that stillness, God became clearer, not louder in a theatrical way, just clearer. Scripture started landing differently. Simple verses about peace, wisdom, rest, and truth began cutting deeper than dramatic promises ever had. You would sit at your kitchen table with coffee gone lukewarm and your Bible open, and one line would feel like it had been waiting for this exact version of you to read it. Not the striving version, not the bargaining version, the stripped-down version. The one silence had emptied enough to finally hear. God was not trying to entertain your pain. He was trying to re-educate your heart, to teach you that love should not demand constant self-abandonment, to teach you that peace and passivity are not the same thing. To teach you that not every connection that feels powerful is holy. To teach you that stillness is not emptiness when He is in it. By then, you had stopped asking silence to return what it had taken. You were beginning to thank it for what it revealed. It had shown you the wound beneath the wound. It had taught you that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you finally understand what was really happening inside you. Sometimes it is the day you stop confusing your need to be chosen with evidence that a relationship was meant to stay. Sometimes it is the quiet recognition that what you called peace was often just chaos you had learned to tolerate because it was familiar. And once you learn that truly learn it, you cannot go back unchanged. The silence that once felt like abandonment starts to look more like rescue. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. It took away the noise, the false hope, the emotional static, and forced you to meet yourself without distraction. And in doing so, it gave you something more valuable than answers from them ever could have. It gave you discernment. It gave you truth. It gave you the beginning of inner freedom. At first, you were almost afraid to admit it, not because healing was wrong, but because it felt disloyal to start feeling lighter after losing someone you had once begged God to keep. There was a strange guilt in noticing that your chest was not as tight some mornings. A strange hesitation in realizing that the room felt calmer now. You did not say it out loud at first. You barely let yourself think it in complete sentences. But the truth was there, rising slowly through the grief like morning light under a door. They left, and something in you started breathing again. It did not happen all at once. Healing rarely arrives like a parade. It comes like a thaw. Quiet, almost invisible at first, until one day you realize the ice is no longer in charge of the landscape. In the beginning, the pain still came in waves. A song in a grocery store. A street you had driven before while talking to them. A quiet Sunday afternoon when memory had too much room to move around. But between those waves, something new was happening. There were moments when your mind was not circling them. Moments when your body was not bracing. Moments when prayer felt less like panic and more like presence. And every one of those moments carried the same quiet revelation. What you thought was going to destroy you was actually starting to release you. You saw it first in your mornings. Before your day often began with emotional static. Even before you checked your phone, your spirit was already half entangled in whatever had or had not happened between you. Were they distant? Were they warm? Were they pulling back? Were you imagining the shift? Was there something you needed to fix, soften, explain, or prepare for? That constant undercurrent had become so normal, you stopped questioning it. It was just how love felt now, you told yourself. But after they were gone, the mornings began changing. Not dramatically, just honestly. You woke up and noticed there was less noise inside you. Less scanning, less emotional bookkeeping, less invisible labor before the day had even started. And with that quiet came something holy: room to think, room to pray, room to notice God again, without layers of relational fog covering every thought. You began sitting at your kitchen table with your coffee and Bible, not because you were trying to prove you were strong, but because you wanted to be there. That was new. For a long time, prayer had felt like emergency response, damage control, pleading, interpreting signs, asking God to rescue what you could feel slipping. But now the tone was different, softer, cleaner. You are no longer coming to Him carrying the full weight of someone else's inconsistency. You are coming as yourself, tired sometimes, yes, tender, yes, still grieving, yes, but present. And God felt closer in that season, not because He had finally arrived, but because so much emotional interference had finally been removed. That realization shook you, because it meant what you once called love had been louder than peace. You started seeing other changes too. Your body felt different. The low-grade anxiety that had once hovered over your days was not gone completely, but it was weakening. You could breathe more deeply. You were not carrying the same invisible tension in your shoulders. Your stomach was not tightening every time your phone lit up. In fact, sometimes your phone would stay silent for hours, and instead of feeling abandoned, you felt relieved. That was when you knew this healing was real. When silence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like protection. When the absence of turmoil began to feel better than the presence of unstable closeness ever had. At first, that clarity made you sad. There is grief in realizing how long something had been hurting you while you were still calling it love. There is grief in recognizing that the version of yourself who kept fighting for it had grown so used to carrying pressure that relief now felt almost unfamiliar. You were not just healing from their departure. You were healing from the long season of emotional strain that came before it. The healing had started after they left, yes, but in another sense it had started the moment the atmosphere around you changed. The moment your spirit no longer had to keep adapting to inconsistency. The moment the door closed and the chaos stopped walking in and out at will. That is when destruction began changing shape in your memory. At first you had seen the ending as a collapse, a breaking, a tearing apart of something precious, and some of that was true. Endings hurt because something is lost even when what is lost was no longer healthy. But as the weeks went on, another interpretation emerged. Maybe this had not been destruction in the truest sense. Maybe it had been extraction. Maybe God had not crushed your life. Maybe He had pulled something out of it that had embedded itself too deeply. Something that was no longer nurturing your future, only draining it. Something you would not have released on your own because you still had memories attached to it. hopes attached to it, identity attached to it. So, he allowed the separation that your emotions would never have chosen because your destiny needed what your feelings could not yet bless. And once that thought took root, everything started looking different. You noticed how much more energy you had for things that were actually life-giving. You called people back who felt safe. You started taking walks without replaying conversations in your head. You listened in church again instead of just surviving the service. You laughed more easily. You noticed sunsets. You noticed that food tasted better when your stomach was not tied in knots. You noticed that you could sit in your own apartment without feeling like every wall held a waiting question. Little mercies began showing up everywhere, like heaven had been trying to hand them to you for months, but your hands had been too full of emotional rubble to receive them. You also became more honest with yourself about what healing actually looked like. It was not glamorous. It was not one grand breakthrough where all the pain vanished and a choir of angels sang over your living room rug. It was choosing not to reopen old conversations just because loneliness knocked. It was letting yourself cry without turning the tears into instructions to go backward. It was saying no to the fantasy that one message, one apology, one sudden return would complete the story better than God already was. Healing was not dramatic. It was disciplined tenderness. It was learning to protect the peace that was finally beginning to grow. And that peace was changing your relationship with God in a way you had not expected. For so long, your faith had been wrapped up in endurance. Keep trusting, keep waiting, keep hoping, keep standing, and there is a season for that. But now, God was showing you another side of faith. Faith was not only staying when things are hard. Sometimes faith is letting go when something is no longer holy to carry. Sometimes faith is believing that God can do more with an empty, surrendered space than you can do with a crowded, chaotic one. Sometimes faith is accepting that what ended did not end because God failed to protect you, but because He finally did. That thought brought tears to your eyes one evening while driving home through the soft gold of late afternoon. You were stopped at a red light, ordinary life all around you, someone mowing a lawn, kids riding bikes, a woman loading groceries into the trunk of an SUV. And suddenly it hit you with such force you had to grip the steering wheel. God had protected you by letting it end, not by preserving your comfort, not by forcing the other person to become what they were not by giving you one more round to prove your loyalty. He had protected you by allowing the separation, and now in the quiet after the ending, your healing was testifying to that truth. They left and you started healing. There was no cleaner evidence than that. If their presence had been necessary for your peace, their absence would have destroyed it. But the opposite was happening. Slowly, steadily, undeniably, you were becoming lighter, clearer, softer in the right ways, stronger in the necessary ones, and closer to God than you had felt in a long time. The devastation you feared had not become the final chapter. It had become the doorway into release. And maybe that is one of the strangest mercies of all. Sometimes you only understand what something was doing to you after it is gone. Sometimes the soul cannot measure the full weight of a burden until it is finally lifted. Sometimes what looked like the breaking of your heart is actually the breaking of a chain. And now, standing in the early light of your own restoration, you were beginning to understand a truth that once would have sounded impossible. They did not ruin you by leaving. God began healing you through it. The more you healed, the more the ending changed shape in your mind. What once looked like rejection began to look like redirection. What once felt like a slammed door in your face began to feel like a door God Himself had quietly closed, not to shame you, not to deprive you, but to stop you from dragging something unfinished, unstable, and spiritually mismatched into a season that required more of you than that relationship could ever support. That realization did not come in one dramatic flash. It settled over time like light gradually filling a room you had spent too many months walking through in the dark. And once that light was there, you could no longer call the loss by the same name. Because not every closed door is rejection. That truth sounds simple until it reaches a wound. Then it becomes revolution. For so long, your pain had interpreted the ending through the oldest fear it knew they left because you were not enough. The connection ended because you failed to hold it together. The door closed because you were too much in the wrong ways or not enough in the right ones. But healing was teaching you to question that narrative. What if the door did not close because you were deficient? What if it closed because the version of life God was calling you into could no longer stay open to what was misaligned with it? What if the loss was not a verdict against your worth, but evidence of your elevation? That possibility forced you to look at the relationship from a different height. When you looked at it only through the lens of emotion, all you saw was attachment, memory, longing, and pain. But when you looked at it through the lens of calling a harder truth came into focus. They were not equipped to go where God was taking you. That did not mean they were evil. It did not mean they had no value. It did not mean every moment between you was fake. It simply meant that their capacity, their maturity, their spiritual posture, their emotional consistency, their willingness to grow, and their ability to honor what was rising in you did not match the altitude of your next season. Some people can appreciate your light when it flickers low enough not to expose them. Fewer can walk beside you when that light starts intensifying. And yours was intensifying. You could feel it now, even if you would not have known how to describe it before. God was strengthening your discernment, deepening your peace, making your spirit less willing to settle for confusion, pulling you toward a more anchored version of yourself, one who did not need chaos to feel chosen, one who no longer translated instability into mystery, one who was beginning to understand authority not as dominance but as alignment. That inner growth was holy, but it was also costly. Because the higher God calls you, the less room there is for what cannot survive truth. And not everyone who loves some version of you can honor the version heaven is now forming. That is the part people rarely say out loud. Some relationships do not fail because love was absent. They fail because growth exposes incompatibility that emotional closeness had been hiding. As long as you were willing to stay in the old pattern, things could continue in their familiar imbalance. But once God started calling you higher, once your spirit stopped settling for half peace, once your boundaries began hardening into wisdom and your softness began pairing itself with truth, the old door could no longer remain open without costing you the very thing God was building. You started seeing it everywhere in hindsight. The tension that rose whenever you became clearer. The distance that followed your honesty. The subtle unease that entered the room when you stopped making everything easy for them. Those were not random hiccups. They were signs. Signs that the connection was not built to carry the weight of your next level. Because every new level requires something from the people around you. It requires humility enough not to resent your growth, security enough not to fear your healing, maturity enough not to punish your boundaries, spiritual health enough not to confuse your calling with a threat. And the painful truth was that they did not have what this season of your life required. At first, that realization felt almost arrogant, and you resisted it. You did not want to become one of those people who turns every ending into a story of superiority. That was never your spirit. But calling is not superiority. Calling is responsibility. And when God marks a life for deeper growth, clearer purpose, stronger peace, and greater spiritual authority, He does not let that life remain tied forever to people who only function well around confusion. This was not about being better than them. It was about being called beyond what they could sustain. There is a difference. And once you understood that difference, the grief began changing again. It became less about asking, why did they not choose me? And more about asking, why was I trying so hard to keep open a door that could not support where God was leading me? That question carried a different kind of sorrow, cleaner sorrow, not humiliation, but awakening. Because part of what hurt was realizing how much of your prayer life had been spent begging for access to what God already knew could not survive the next chapter of your becoming. You saw it more clearly the way you now move through life. Your mind was sharper. Your prayer life was steadier. Your self-respect had more spine in it. Your spirit was less willing to negotiate with confusion just because it came wrapped in chemistry or history or loneliness. You had changed. Not into someone cold, but into someone who could no longer call a destabilizing door home. And if you had changed that much after it closed, what would have happened if it had stayed open? How much of your growth would have been delayed? How much of your clarity would have been softened? How much of your authority would have been traded away just to preserve connection? That question answered itself. You began to understand that higher calling often requires narrower gates. Not because God is cruel, but because what is sacred cannot remain endlessly accessible to what mishandles it. The next level of your life was not simply about receiving more blessings or more visible favor. It was about carrying more truth, more discernment, more emotional integrity, more spiritual weight. And people who are unequipped for that level do not just remain neutral in your life. They become resistance, sometimes gentle resistance, sometimes unconscious resistance, sometimes painful, personal, heartbreaking resistance, but resistance all the same. That is why the door had to close. It closed because you were called higher than their comfort zone could tolerate. It closed because your peace mattered more than preserving access. It closed because your future could not be built in constant negotiation with someone who only felt secure when you were smaller, softer, more uncertain, more endlessly available. It closed because the next version of you needed room to stand without being edited back into an easier shape. It closed because spiritual authority grows best where confusion is no longer allowed to nest. You felt that authority beginning to rise now quietly but unmistakably, in the way you no longer begged for what should come with mutuality, in the way you could feel compassion without reopening unhealthy access, in the way you no longer interpreted every loss as failure, in the way you could sit with yourself, with God, with stillness, without panicking that silence meant abandonment. That was authority. Not loud, not flashy, not theatrical, just rooted, clear, governed by peace. And the relationship that ended had not been able to walk with that version of you, so the door closed. Not because God wanted you humiliated, but because He wanted you whole. Not because heaven had rejected your heart, but because heaven had recognized your calling. Not because you were unworthy of love, but because you were worthy of a love that would not require you to shrink, blur, or betray your own spirit to keep it alive. Some doors do not close to punish you. They close because the person on the other side is not built for the height of your next season. And that truth did not make the loss painless, but it made it sacred. It gave the ending a holy context. It told you that what looked like exclusion was often protection, that what felt like being shut out was sometimes God escorting you upward, that not every person who cannot come with you is a tragedy. Some are simply proof that your life is no longer allowed to remain at a level where confusion is mistaken for connection. You were called higher, and because you were called higher, the door did what some doors must do when heaven is involved. It closed before your emotions could talk God out of your own elevation. There comes a moment in healing that feels less like comfort and more like confrontation. A moment when the truth no longer stands at the edge of your awareness, whispering politely, but steps fully into the room and asks to be named. You had been circling that moment for weeks, maybe months. You had felt it in pieces, in the lighter mornings, in the cleaner prayers, in the unexpected relief that followed the grief, in the way your spirit no longer ached for the relationship with the same blindness it once did. But now the revelation arrived, whole sharp, almost overwhelming in its clarity. The very thing you begged God to preserve was the very thing delaying your peace. You sat with that truth for a long time because it rearranged everything. It did not merely explain the ending, it exposed the deeper pattern beneath it. You had spent so much time asking heaven to save what was hurting you that you had not considered the possibility that God's refusal was mercy, not silence. You thought he was withholding restoration. In reality, he was protecting transformation. You thought you were losing something that was meant to bless you. In reality, you were being separated from something that had already begun blocking what God was trying to grow in you. That kind of revelation humbles you because it forces you to admit how badly pain can distort desire. You can beg for the survival of what is familiar, even when familiar is suffocating you. You can call something precious simply because you have invested deeply in it. You can call something meant to be because it touched you powerfully, even while it steadily erodes your clarity. You can confuse emotional attachment with divine assignment. And that was the hardest part to face. Not that the relationship ended, but that you had mistaken the fight to keep it alive for spiritual loyalty when at times it had actually been resistance to being freed. Once that truth broke open, other truths came rushing in behind it. You saw how your peace had been delayed. Not stolen all at once, but delayed, interrupted, held back by the constant emotional turbulence their presence created in your life. It was difficult to live deeply in peace when your inner world kept revolving around inconsistency. Difficult to remain settled when your mind had grown used to scanning for shifts, decoding silence, recalculating hope. Peace requires space. Peace requires truth. Peace requires a clean enough atmosphere for the soul to stop bracing. But what you had called love had been filling that atmosphere with static for so long that you forgot what unbroken peace even felt like. You saw how your discernment had been clouded too. That part troubled you almost more than the rest because discernment is sacred. It is one thing to be emotionally tired. It is another thing to realize your spiritual sight had been dimmed. You remembered the many times you had sensed something was off and then talked yourself out of it. The many times your spirit had raised a small flag and your heart had folded it away before anyone could see. The many times you asked God for clarity while privately hoping clarity would not require separation. That is what clouding does. It does not always erase your discernment. Sometimes it simply weakens your willingness to trust it. It makes you question what you know, because what you know threatens what you want. And as long as they remained in your life, that battle kept repeating. Your spirit would whisper, your attachment would negotiate, your peace would waver, your clarity would blur, over and over. Then there was the slow transformation you now saw had been hindered. You were growing, yes, even in the pain. God wastes nothing. But how much faster might you have become whole if you had not been pouring so much energy into sustaining what was no longer aligned? How much deeper might your healing have gone sooner if your emotional life had not been crowded by the need to preserve something unstable? How much more of God might you have heard if your prayers had not been so consistently entangled in relational survival? That question was not meant to shame you. It was meant to wake you, because sometimes growth is not blocked by obvious evil. Sometimes it is blocked by what you keep calling necessary long after heaven has marked it as finished. And that was the revelation peak. What blocked you could not bless you. Say it slowly enough, and it splits the story open. What blocked you could not bless you. What kept your peace delayed could not be your promise. What clouded your discernment could not be your covering. What slowed your transformation could not be your destiny. It may have mattered. It may have touched your heart. It may have taught you things. It may even have held real tenderness in certain seasons. But if by the end it had become a blockage to peace, clarity, healing, obedience, and growth, then no amount of memory could transform it into blessing. God does not call you to worship what is obstructing you. That thought landed with force because it exposed the difference between sentiment and truth. Sentiment says, but there were good moments. Truth says good moments do not make a misaligned thing safe to keep. Sentiment says, but I loved them. Truth says love does not automatically equal alignment. Sentiment says, but I prayed so hard for it to work. Truth says prayer does not sanctify what is slowing the work God is doing in you. Sentiment wants to preserve emotional history. Truth wants to liberate your future, and your future needed liberation. You felt that in your spirit so strongly now that it almost made you grieve in a new way. Not grief for losing them this time, but grief for how long you had pleaded for permission to stay blocked. How many prayers had you prayed from a place of fear rather than faith? How many tears had been asking God to maintain access to what he was trying to remove? How many times had you interpreted his silence as absence when he was actually refusing to help you rebuild the very thing keeping you from rising? There is pain in that realization, but there is also awe. Because it means God was more committed to your freedom than your feelings were. That changed the way you remembered the unanswered prayers. They were not unanswered in the way you thought. They were answered at a higher level than you were praying from. You asked for preservation. God answered with purification. You asked for return. God answered with release. You asked him to keep the door open. He answered by clearing the hallway. You asked for the relationship to survive. He answered by protecting the version of you that could not survive if it did. No wonder the healing began after the separation. No wonder your mind became clearer. No wonder your spirit could hear again. No wonder peace began returning like something long exiled. The blockage had been moved. The thing you thought was part of your blessing had actually been standing in front of it, casting a shadow so long you mistook the shadow for fate. After the separation, your life did not become louder. It became truer. That was the beginning of elevation, not applause, not instant public reward, not some dramatic overnight transformation that made everyone who hurt you suddenly regret losing access to you. It began in quieter ways, deeper ways. Your faith stopped sounding like panic and started sounding like trust. Your prayers became less desperate, less crowded, less tangled in who stayed and who left. You are no longer asking God to prove your worth through somebody's return. You are beginning to understand that His protection had already spoken. And with that understanding, your identity grew clearer. You stopped seeing yourself as the one who had been abandoned and started seeing yourself as the one who had been redirected. You stopped measuring your value by who could hold you and started measuring it by what God was growing in you. Your self-respect came back slowly, but when it returned, it came back with backbone. You no longer felt the need to over-explain your heart, overextend your grace, or reopen doors that had already revealed why they were not safe. Then new doors began to open, not all at once, but enough to prove the point. Healthier connections, cleaner peace, stronger discernment, a deeper relationship with God, a steadier version of yourself. Opportunities you would not have been emotionally available for before. Moments of joy that did not require chaos to make them feel intense. It was all evidence of the same truth: the loss had not ruined your future. It had protected it. That was the bloom after the breaking, the elevation after the separation, and now you could finally see that God did not remove them to make your life smaller. He removed them so your real life could finally begin. Now you understand. You were never abandoned. You were uncovered. God removed them to reveal you. For so long you thought the story was about loss, about being left behind, about watching someone walk away and wondering what in you had failed to make them stay. But the ending was never a statement about your lack. It was a rescue from what could not carry your destiny. It was heaven refusing to let your future remain tied to a weight that kept delaying your peace, clouding your discernment, and shrinking your becoming. They did not leave with your worth. They left with their access. And once that access was gone, the real you began to rise. The you who hears God more clearly. The you who no longer mistakes chaos for connection. The you who can love deeply without abandoning yourself. The you who does not beg, close doors to become holy just because they once felt important. The you who walks with peace, with spiritual authority, with cleaner vision, with deeper trust. The you who finally understands that some people are not lost from your life because you failed. They are removed because your calling can no longer travel crowded. That is the reversal. You are not the rejected one. You are the protected one. You are not the one who was left behind. You are the one who was moved ahead. You are not standing in ruins. You are standing in cleared ground. And now, with a steadier heart and a stronger spirit, you move forward differently. Not bitter, not hardened, not haunted by the old door. You move forward revealed, more whole, more awake, more aligned with what heaven has been doing all along. God removed them, yes. But what He was really doing was making sure that nothing blocked the version of you that was finally ready to rise.